Hi everyone. So today in our Journey to Wellness group meeting, we are going to be talking about cholesterol. So most of you by now have heard about wanting to have a lower carb lifestyle to lower our insulin levels. We've talked about how insulin resistance can lead to all kinds of harmful things, including diabetes, but then also things like heart disease, and it actually affects mental health and so on. So if you're not eating carbohydrates, right, how are you going to get energy in your body? Well, obviously, we've discussed that higher fat approach. And for generations, we have been telling people that higher fat leads to heart disease. So how in the world can I eat higher fat and lower carb? Like, what is going on? So I want to talk a little bit about cholesterol. I want to point out that there are a lot of researchers out there doing work on cholesterol. The research is really showing that cholesterol is not what we thought it was. So I want to go through some of those studies. I want to talk about what really causes heart disease, just briefly. And I want you guys to think about this. Now, remember, I am not a medical doctor. I'm not asking you to change any medications, and I am not asking you to change under medical advice, but I want you to research these things yourself. And I'm going to put in the show notes for those of you watching online. All the studies that I am talking about, all the links that you see pop up in my preview, there'll be links in my show notes, as well as a link to some of the other things that I discuss. I may actually put some links in there for some YouTube talks that I have watched that I believe really will be helpful for helping you understand what's going on there. So first thing we need to do is talk about the diet heart hypothesis. This is probably the most common misnomer in science. And so what does this even say, right? And you're going to be familiar with this. The diet is high in saturated fat. So personally, I am eating a predominantly carnivore diet. I eat very little vegetables, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And those are just leafy greens at this point, mainly because I find that that works best for my body. But that means that I'm eating a diet that is naturally higher in saturated fat. I eat red meat 6, if not 7 days a week. So according to the diet heart hypothesis, high saturated fat leads to high levels of cholesterol. So that the low and the high density, we'll talk about all of those things. So if you have high density lipoproteins, that would lead to plaque in your arteries, according to the diet heart hypothesis. Then if you have plaque in your vessels, that would of course lead to heart attacks and strokes, right? And so if this is all true, if these 3 gray arrows are actually stating true things, then diets high in saturated fats therefore must lead to heart attacks and strokes. So I'm going to go through this and I'm going to debunk some of this, and I'm going to point out some myths and some errors in general thinking. So does a diet high in saturated fats lead to cardiovascular disease, right? That was the therefore, that was the last result. So if that's true, then does that really happen? So there was some correlational data done by the World Health Organization showing that higher levels of saturated fats in a diet are actually associated with lower rates of death from cardiovascular disease in Europeans. In fact, the highest fat diets were those of the French, who typically, I know we all know the French are skinny, right? Who typically have 40% of their diet coming from fat. Now, that's not all saturated fat, but there is saturated fat in their diet. It's not specifically excluded. And their obesity rate was less than 10%. So here's a graph showing what happens in men, okay? So on the bottom of the graph, it says saturated fat as a percent of energy. So those are percentages of your saturated fat. And on the left-hand side, it shows death rate per 100,000. These were coronary heart disease. CHD is coronary heart disease. So this is going to be strokes, heart attacks, cardiovascular disease. And if you notice, it's kind of a scatter plot. And each one of the dots represents a country. And if you notice, the general overall trend shows that the higher a saturated fat was, the lower the cardiovascular disease. In case you were curious, it's the same exact thing in women, except in women, it's a little bit more steep. It's a little bit more obvious that the women are showing lower levels of cardiovascular disease. So wait, what you're telling me is that less cardiovascular disease with higher fat? All right, well, let's keep going. The Women's Health Initiative study was a study done on over 160,000 postmenopausal women. These women were from the age of 50 to 79 when they were in this study. The study lasted about 15 years, which in any kind of study, that's an incredible amount of time. That's just an incredibly long study. This was one of the most expensive studies that was ever done in the United States history. And so the dietary component it was an 8-year study. So most diet studies that you see, even the most recent, Netflix movie that I've watched, it's a documentary about why you should be vegan instead of omnivore, was only done for like 8 weeks. 8 weeks versus 8 years. So when you watch a dietary study, in 8 weeks, my body has time to barely adjust to the food. So when you're thinking about a study of dietary stuff, you really need to look at stuff that is not associational and is not short term. We need longer term studies. So this one is one of the gold standards. So the dietary modification component of this was based on a lower diet approach to eating. What they wanted to do is they wanted to help women reduce their health risk from cardiovascular disease. So the women needed to maintain a 20% or less total dietary fat, right? So 20% or less, which is currently sort of what they recommend. Really low dietary fat. So how did they support these women? Well, first of all, they trained them. What is dietary fat? How do I eat it? How do I eat low? They gave them weekly to monthly support meetings, and they even did individual consultations over the course of the 8 years. So they were trained and trained and trained and trained, and they kept being supported, which is why there were so few women that were dropping out of the study as opposed to normal studies where people back off. I don't know about you, but telling me I need to do something for 8 years is a long time. But if I keep supporting you along the way, it's a lot easier. Women were encouraged to increase their fruits, increase their vegetables, and increase their grains in their diet, right? That's how you're going to get to a lower fat approach because you need to get rid of meats because meats have fat. And more than, so like I eat a ribeye for dinner, that ribeye is approximately the same number of grams of fat as there are protein in them. And it's not by weight, it's by like the grams. And that ends up being more of my calories from fat. So women were eating very, very lean meat. They were eating fish, fruits, grains, and vegetables. So what were the results after 8 years? Well, they did indeed lower their lipid levels. So their overall LDLs, cholesterols, total cholesterols did drop some, and their blood pressures got better. Now I'll say this, if you're eating fruits, grains, and vegetables, as opposed to the standard American processed food, you're already improving your health because your body is eating whole food as opposed to junk food that's messed up. So these women obviously had that. And I'm not saying that eating that kind of a vegan type of diet is going to be harmful to you. I'll get into that in a different video, but the point is it's much better to eat whole foods. But what about cardiovascular disease, right? That was the whole point of the study. What they found was the women who ate a low-fat diet did not reduce their risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, or heart attack. They were the same even if they maintained this 20% lower fat. So the higher fat diet that some people were eating did not increase their risk versus this diet, right? This diet was kind of, sadly, kind of a flop in that most of the women even didn't lose as much weight as they had hoped and all of those things. So this reduction in the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke was not linked to lowering their fat in their diet. So my question is the fat that's associated with my ribeye, is the fat associated with bacon a bad fat? Or do I have bad information, right? Maybe I just have bad information about what it is. So I want you to look at this graphic. This graphic is from the National Institutes of Health and an organization called hearttruth.gov. You notice it says .gov. If it's a .gov, that means it is run by the government. And what it's telling me to do in this is to start using the low saturated fat oils like canola, safflower, sunflower, corn oils, okay? Sesame, peanut, and even that fake stuff in a butter tub called margarine. And then it's saying less, choose the coconut, butter, beef, palm oil, pork fat, right? So all the animal fats, all the solid fats. So I want to say we need to disregard this information because those healthier fats have been directly linked to inflammation increases in our body. And increased inflammation actually leads to increased risk for heart disease. So if diets high in saturated fats are not causing heart disease and heart attacks and strokes, now what do we need to know, right? So why do we even care about cholesterol at all, right? If raising our cholesterol, yes, saturated fats can raise your cholesterol. They absolutely can. But why do we care about it? Like, what is this molecule? Like, we've been told to demonize it our whole lives. Well, I'm a biology teacher, and one of the four main components of your cell membrane, right? Some of it's proteins, some of it's something called a phospholipid, but one of the main components is cholesterol. Without cholesterol, you will die. You have to have cholesterol. So why do we care about cholesterol? Unfortunately, we've cared a lot about cholesterol in the way of saying it's bad for us because we're worried about those plaques on the inside of our arteries. So if you look at that picture, we have recently, within the last 20 years, decided HDL is good and LDL is the bad one, right? We just need to keep the LDL down. So let's talk about the different kinds of cholesterol, what they do in our body, and why we need them. HDL, we call the good cholesterol. It prevents plaque from building up in your arteries. So one of the things that HDL does is it actually transports fats around, and it actually is protective of your arteries. It prevents your body from having excess clotting, right? And if we know heart attacks and strokes are actually a clot, usually blocking an artery or a vessel. It's not just like quick, it's a clot that pops in there. HDL also prevents the breakdown of beta cells in your pancreas. So your pancreas has lots and lots of jobs for digestion. One of the most important is the beta cells, which is part of your pancreas, are responsible for producing your insulin. Remember, and we've talked about insulin. Without insulin, you can't get any sugar into your bloodstream, from your bloodstream into your cells, and your cells will start to starve, okay? You also can't build muscle. You also can't build anything. So insulin is really important for us. LDL is referred to as the bad cholesterol. So is all LDL the same? Well, actually it's not. And that's where it gets tricky, right? We used to think all cholesterol was the same, and then we learned about the difference between HDL and LDL. And now we think LDL is all bad, but the reality is it comes in different sizes. And some of the sizes of LDL can be harmful to your body and do indicate risk for heart disease, and some are not harmful to your body. There are tests that can be done to determine the particle size and what particle sizes you have in your own bloodstream. And I'm going to talk to you about how we can indicate those things. So the large LDL particles we call fluffy. We call them large and fluffy. And they're so large that they actually can't get through your cell membranes, and so they can't infiltrate into the cell and do any kind of damage, cause any inflammation. Whereas the smaller particles actually do infiltrate the cells and cause some inflammation and cause some leaky gut kind of problems. And so we need to, maybe not leaky gut, but there's some problems with what they do to your cells. So we want large fluffy particles, not small ones. So the total amount of your LDL doesn't matter. It's the size of the particles. Okay, so all LDL does is it indicates that there are fats moving around in your bloodstream. Now, I'm personally still losing weight. I'm not losing quickly, but I am still losing weight. And as an active weight loser, I am going to have particles of fat floating around in my bloodstream because they're going from my fat cells stored to my cells that need energy to burn them. And so this process of burning fat, I'm going to be moving around. Is this bad, right? Is my heart going to die? No. This is an indicator that my body is moving around cholesterol. Is my cholesterol healthy or fat? And so we need to look at that. So when doctors talk to you about HDL, I want you to think about your HDL level, and I really want you to try to get 50 or higher if possible. I struggle with it genetically. I just don't make a lot of HDL. I have finally worked my way up to 48. I was in the 30s before, so I'm up to 48. And so the higher my HDL goes, the better. I was looking at somebody else's HDL just the other day, and their HDL was 92. I'm like, dang. And it's just genetics, right? There's a lot of that. But it's also can be controlled by diet. And we're going to talk about that. The other fat that we're going to talk about in your bloodstream is triglycerides. Now, this one I really want you to pay attention to because triglycerides are an indicator of many things that are going on in your body. So it's a fat that circulates through your bloodstream. It's moving fat from your fat cells to your liver and back. Okay. And so again, triglycerides are a molecule moving fat around. Excessive amounts of triglycerides, though, your body doesn't want. Your body wants to keep a standard level of triglycerides in their body. And so it will store those as fat deposits in your liver and in your muscles, as well as your fat cells. So when your fat cells, especially when your fat cells are getting stuffed, or when you have an excessive amount of triglycerides at any one point in time, your body's like, oh, we need to store that. I need to store that. There's too much of that. And so it'll deposit it in your liver. It also deposits in your muscles, which is not where you want fat. So very high levels of triglycerides, like over 500, are known to lead to things called pancreatitis, which is inflammation of your pancreas, because not only do the fats store in your liver and your muscles, but if you get them too high, your body will actually start trying to deposit it into your pancreas. It deposits it all your muscles, including your tongue. So some people, they get sleep apnea when they get heavier because their tongue is actually in the back is starting to get fattier. I know that sounds crazy. It's called fatty tongue. Listen to Dr. Barry. He has some video stuff about that. But so you build it there, you build it in your pancreas. Pancreatitis is this inflammation of the pancreas, and you'll end up in the hospital potentially with a flare-up of this. It's very painful. High levels of triglycerides floating around your bloodstream can actually lead to atherosclerosis. That's where the hardening of the arteries comes in. That's where the plaques are starting to build up on the walls on the inside. And those plaques will start to build up because of inflammation, and inflammation leads to those plaques, and then eventually they can lead to rupture. And those ruptures are where you have the clots floating around, you have the heart attacks and strokes. So we don't want those, right? We want to know what really causes it. Now, we used to think that cholesterol was what caused those plaques because there's cholesterol in the plaque, but it doesn't mean that the cholesterol causes the plaque. So remember, we showed that there's no association between the amount of cholesterol in the right kinds associated with the plaque buildup. So remember, we're building fatty in our liver, so it's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I was diagnosed with that many years ago. No one told me it was caused by triglycerides, and nobody told me it caused triglycerides. Okay, so what causes those, right? Why do we have high triglycerides? And there's actually correlational studies that show this. Excessive amounts of carbohydrates in your diet. So we switched our diets as a whole, as a society, to try to get people to eat about 60% of our diet to be grains. That's carbohydrates. Even if they're healthy grains, they're still carbohydrates. And so your body doesn't know what else to do with excessive amounts of carbohydrates, but to turn them into triglycerides, which then will eventually be stored as fats in your body. The bane of our existence, whether we realize it or not, is fructose. Fructose is a fruit sugar, and fructose can only be processed by your liver. High fructose corn syrup, that's what HFCS stands for. High fructose corn syrup is a cheap way for manufacturing processed foods to put sugars into things. It's a lot cheaper than sugar cane, right? Sugar cane is more expensive because it's found in the tropics than is corn. And if they have excess corn, they can turn it into high fructose corn syrup. Fructose also leads to leaky gut. This is actually true. It does cause problems with your gut absorbing toxins that you do not need. Really, if you get nothing else from this talk, stop high fructose corn syrup from going into your diet and limit your fruits to things that are low in sugar, right? Because fructose as a whole is bad. Another sugar slash ethanol is not a sugar. It's an energy molecule though. Ethanol actually also gets processed by your liver. And so again, if we're processing it by our liver, it's going to turn it into triglycerides when there's excessive amounts. Now, can you have alcohol in small quantities? Personally, I've made the decision not to because my liver is healing from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The last thing I want to do is give it alcoholic fatty liver disease, right? And we all know, generationally, we know that alcoholics end up problems with their liver. So if drinking alcohol is causing problems with my liver, I don't want to do that. And then there are some medications. Here is the list that you can find that will help you find all the different medications that might increase your triglycerides. So if you have to take medications for many different conditions, some of them will actually raise your natural triglyceride levels. And that may not be on the black box label that you get from the doctor. So if you need to look them up, okay? So what's a number? What's a number we should care about? All right, let me move my little face out of your way. So I suggest that you make sure you know your triglyceride levels. That one's a very important one. HDL and triglycerides, those two are the ones that I care about, okay? LDL doesn't matter, and you'll see why in a second. So normal triglycerides are below 150. Normal is below 150. I never got below 150 until I gave up carbohydrates. I just couldn't do it. My body didn't want to do that. Now my triglycerides range between 85 and 100. Ideal is below 100, but normal is below 150. If you're borderline high and so on, remember what I said, at 500 or above, that very high category, that's when you're going to be risking things like pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas, etc. So let's continue talking about particle sizes, right? Let's talk about how do you know if you have big fluffy or small and dense, right? Small and dense. Standard cholesterol tests really don't do that. They measure the total volume of LDL. It's kind of a calculation method. They spin them in a centrifuge and they weigh it basically, so to speak. And so they don't tell you how many particles you have. What they do is they tell you the total cholesterol. So when I'm actively losing weight, my total cholesterol volume is going to go up. Why? Because the particles are moving fat from my stored fat into my other cells where they're burning it as energy, right? Because I'm burning fat as fuel, and that fat is actually turning into ketones, which my body can use as direct energy, including my brain. So I want to talk about this molecule called ApoB. ApoB is a particle on the outside of the LDL molecule. So like each of the LDL molecules will have an ApoB on it, like a single ApoB marker. It has this one level of marker. And so the more LDL particles I have, the more ApoB I will have. So right, the more particles I have, the more ApoB I have, because each LDL has ApoB on it. ApoB has been directly indicated in increased atherosclerosis, right? So you're trying to avoid heart disease. You need to reduce the total number of cholesterol particles, not the size. We want big, fluffy ones, okay? So large LDL particles are less atherosclerotic, meaning they cause less heart disease, because there's less of the particles, because they each are bigger, they individually can carry more cholesterol, right? So there's going to be less ApoB floating around in your system. Less ApoB, less risk of cardiovascular disease. So we want to get ourselves into that fluffy particle zone, okay? So if we look at this diagram, it shows you the size of the molecules on the bottom. That's what the bottom of the graph shows, is the size. And on the left shows the density of the fats on the inside, like what's on the inside of each particle. HDL is the first level there. And if you look, there's a bracket on the bottom that says ApoB. ApoB starts showing in the LDL particles. There's something called IDLs and VLDLs. Those VLDLs last for like a minute or two in your bloodstream. That's actually what comes out of your liver, and your body starts to use some of the stuff, and it actually shrinks down into LDLs. So the more LDL particles I have, the more ApoBs I get, right? The more ApoBs I get. You notice HDL does not have ApoB markers, right? That's why it's considered a good cholesterol. So if you look at this diagram, what you can get is that both of these individuals have 130 milligrams per deciliter of cholesterol. That's their norm. And because of that, the one with more individual particles is going to have a higher risk. So they're considered pattern B, and pattern A is considered low risk. So how do I tell my particle size, right? Well, obviously, you can take a blood test. Unfortunately, those blood tests are expensive, and most of your doctors wouldn't even know how to order them. Like, I was trying to have a blood test done, and my doctor's office was having a hard time figuring out where the boxes were on their program to even order that specific test. So you can get this done. It's a much more expensive test. Your insurance probably won't cover it, or doesn't need to unless you have a severe risk. So let's use your normal blood tests to calculate your triglyceride to HDL ratio. So you're going to take your triglyceride number. My last one was 104. And your HDL, my last one was 48. And I'm going to take 104 divided by 48 to get a number. The higher that number, the more likely you are to have pattern B with small, dense lipoparticles. Okay, so you're going to have this low density, small particles. The ideal ratio is 2 or less. So I've been eating this way for a year, and mine is right at about 2, right? I'm like 2.1, I think 2.16 if I remember. 104 divided by 48. It's also going to indicate whether you're insulin resistant. So the higher the number, the higher your triglycerides, the lower your HDL, the more insulin resistant you are. You want that number to be below 1.5, and I'm not there, right? I'm still at that 2.16, so I've got a little ways to go. But I want to look at this graph, okay? This graph, I'm the science person, right? The graphs make me happy. So on the bottom is the triglyceride to HDL indicator. So what did I say mine was? Mine's about 2.1, so I'm way over here to the right, okay? And so if you notice the boxes, the black boxes, the small ones, are small, dense particles, right? And I want less small, dense particles. I want the larger LDL particles, which are the open boxes. And if you notice, the lower my number gets, triglyceride to HDL, the better my cholesterol profile is, right? The less of these small, dense particles I have. Now, I don't need mine all the way down here to be considered healthy, right? Ideal is 2. It's still pretty high. But if we get down to 1.5, which is where we want to be for insulin resistance, now we're at about halfway in between. And so we really want to lower the number of small particles we have and increase the larger particles. So how do I prevent getting SDA, small dense lipoproteins in the first place? How do I prevent this? Well, first of all, we have all heard that trans fats are bad. Well, do you even know what they are, right? Most of us just find them on the back of a grocery label. Trans fats in your diet are actually mostly caused by heating of seed oils, safflower, canola, peanut, right? So like those of you who like deep fried turkey at Thanksgiving and peanut oil, heating the peanut oil is not so good for you. And that small, dense particles. So this is why a lot of people say get rid of fried foods. It's not the fried food. It's the what you're frying it in. If you're frying it in things like bacon grease or beef tallow, you're not going to get trans fats in your diet. And so that's the only thing I cook with anymore, is bacon grease and butter and tallow, things like that. I have gotten rid of all seed oils. The only exceptions are olives, avocados, and coconuts. Those seeds are processed cold. They're squeezed and you actually can get the oils directly out of them. I will link in our show notes a link that I saw how they actually process the other seed oils. You do not want those in your body. The chemicals they're using are like cancer causing agents, hexane. They're using bleach to make things prettier and smell better. You do not need that in your body. Another thing to increase the right particle size is increased activity levels. Sedentary lives meaning sitting around all the time, increases the amount of small particles you have. You want big, fluffy, not small. Okay. You need to reverse your insulin resistance and overall metabolic syndrome. And the only way to reduce insulin resistance is lower that circulating insulin on a regular basis. So fasting does a lot for that because you're only eating a couple times a day. But also lowering your diet for carbohydrates, right? Insulin goes up every time you consume carbohydrates. So if you're consuming a diet high in carbohydrates and you eat carbohydrates 3 or 4 or 6 times a day, you're going to increase your insulin on a regular basis. Personally, I eat about twice a day, sometimes 3. But when I do, my carbohydrates are so low that my insulin is actually slowly declining. This graphic is really kind of shows you what's going on. Remember, ApoB, 1 ApoB for every particle you have. So I want you to look. The least risked person is Jerry on the left. He has one big fluffy LDL particle that's holding all 125 milligrams. Now that's not literally the numbers, but everybody in this thing has got the exact same numbers. And the way Jerry's are showing up is all big and fluffy. Whereas Leslie on the right, she's got all small particles, so she's got more particles. Her particles are only partially filled. So decreasing the amount of particles you have and having your cholesterol be in those particles. So see how that number, that 125, doesn't mean anything if we don't know the profile of Leslie and Jerry's individual LDL particles. And so Leslie's going to have a higher risk. So I want to talk about the Framingham Heart Study. Sorry, this is going a little long, but I want to make sure cholesterol is covered properly. The largest study to determine the effects of cholesterol and cardiovascular disease in humans, right? So it's looked at 3 generations of individuals from Framingham with over 15,000 participants, right? So we got grandparents, parents, and then grandchildren over the course of their decades of their lives. So what are some notable findings? So like you can research so much on the Framingham Heart Study, but I wanna go on some notable things. Notable study was done in the 60s. They discovered that cigarette smoking is directly associated with cardiovascular disease. So if you're a smoker, you need to stop the best you can if you want to reduce your risk of heart disease. Number 2, they discovered that people who had increased high blood pressure on a regular basis were at a higher risk for strokes. This makes sense because your small little vessels are dealing with all that internal pressure pushing on the outside of them. Strokes are often caused by a burst in vessel, not just a blocked vessel. Third thing they found is low HDL. Remember, HDL is our buddy. Low HDL was actually associated with an increased risk of overall death. So having low HDL is a bad thing. You don't want to lower your HDL, which is why I'm trying so hard to raise my HDL. It's poor little 48. Now, there has been 15,000 participants, no statistical difference for cardiovascular risk if your LDL was elevated over the age of 50. Now, there are some indicators under the age of 50 that LDL levels can make a difference. But again, they didn't look at the fluffy versus the non. Those are other studies that I'm citing, not the Framingham study. So if you have high HDL levels and elevated LDL levels and you're over 50, there is nothing to worry about when it comes to your cholesterol. And if your doctor is trying to tell you that there is, you need to point them to these studies. So there's an online calculator that you can use to assess your overall risk for cardiovascular event over the next 10 years. So what's my chances? So personally, I did mine, and my risk is 0.7%, extremely low. So this is going to ask you, the only things it asks for is your blood pressure, your HDL, your total cholesterol, your age, your gender, and your smoking status. I hate to tell you, gentlemen, your gender makes it you're more at risk than women. Obviously, the older you get, you go more risk. That HDL matters, right? The higher it is, the better. And if your blood pressure is under control, great. So it's called the Framingham Risk Score. And if you just Google that, you don't have to look for the specific link. The Framingham Risk Score calculator, it'll help you find it. So are there benefits to LDL? I mean, obviously, we know that it can cause heart disease and plaque, according to this. Well, in the small particles, those can be dangerous. But are there benefits? So recently, a study was done on women who were born before the 1926 to determine how cholesterol impacted their overall longevity. How long did they live? What was their life like? Okay, so HDL levels measured for women after the age of 68 didn't indicate anything, right? So like higher, lower, after the age of 68, where your HDL levels were didn't indicate that you survived longer, okay? Women with the highest, I repeat that, the highest two categories of LDL had a higher chance of surviving to 90 with intact mobility. So if you had high LDL, you were more likely to keep moving and live to 90. Another study that was done found that individuals over the age of 65 showed higher levels of cognitive function if they had higher levels of LDL. So women with too low of an LDL over the age of 65 actually lost cognitive functions. So this left scientists wondering, is LDL protective for the brain? Does it help our brain? Does it keep our cognition functioning? Well, your brain definitely needs cholesterol. Remember I said it's a big part of your cell membranes, and there's a lot going on there. So when you start reaching older ages, that's when your doctors seem to be pushing all these drugs on you. And the research is actually not bearing up. The research is showing that high levels of LDL are actually protective of your brain. They're protective of your longevity. And so I want you to really think about this, and I want you to point these out with your doctors if they start discussing with you taking medication to lower your LDLs. So total cholesterol and LDL levels, in my final thoughts, are really only going to matter if your HDL and triglycerides are in those unhealthy ranges, right? Remember, HDL, you want it to be, if you can, 50 or higher. Triglycerides, if you can, 150 to 100 or lower. If you're in those ranges, you're doing fine. Diabetes, insulin resistance, and obesity all definitely increase cardiovascular disease. So my obesity that I was living with as I was eating my low-fat diet, trying to do the right things, was actually causing my diabetes, causing my insulin resistance, and leading me to be stuck in obesity. Now, I'm not going to blame it all on bad advice, but I am going to say if I'd had this advice when I was in my 30s, my body might be different today. LDL levels are protective of brains and health in older adults. If you're greater than 50, LDL is not what we thought it was. The best way to raise your HDL and lower your triglycerides, remember that's what we want, is a low carb diet. So don't eat the processed crap, don't eat the sugars, don't eat the boxed and packaged stuff. Stay away from things like potatoes and sweet potatoes for the most part. If you're going to splurge, that's your splurge, right? An occasional one of those. Stay with whole foods. And then increase your exercise. Remember, and we'll talk about exercise in another video and what it does on the body and how it affects it. Do not exercise your way to weight loss. You exercise your way to health. You want to be stronger, you want to be fitter, not because you want to be skinny, because you can't over-exercise. You can't exercise your way out of a bad fork, right? If you're overeating, you're going to gain weight. Statins, the whole class of statins out there, are responsible for lowering all cholesterol levels. They don't just lower the unhealthy ones. And so I want you to think about that before you take a statin drug. And I will have a link in the show notes for a guy named Dr. David Diamond, and he talks about statins. There's a lot of really hinky research on statins, and I worry. I've seen some studies that have shown that actually people taking statins increase their dementia-like symptoms, and when they remove them from the statins, the dementia-like symptoms went away. When they put them back on the statins, they actually gain their symptoms of dementia back. So personally, for my own choice, I'm going to avoid statins at all costs. I believe there are other ways that I can manage my heart health risk. Finally, I want you to go to that calculator, right? Go to the Framingham Health Score calculator and put in your own numbers. Look for your own numbers and put in your own numbers and find your cardiovascular risk. Heart disease is an absolute killer, number 2 killer in women. And probably I think the number 1 killer in men. It's a horrible thing. We have a ton of it. And I completely understand why your doctors are in panic mode. They are hearing about a medicine that they can give you because they don't believe we as humans can actually change our diet to heal our bodies. And I want to say that if your doctor is afraid for you, if they're worried about your heart, get some more testing done. You can do something called a calcium artery score, a CAC score. Get that. Make sure you have actual edited numbers and actual information before you decide to take a medication that could affect you. And then work on your diet. There are things you can do. Dive down the rabbit hole like me in the YouTube land and find out the information about how to make your heart healthier. And I wish you the best of luck. Heart disease is awful, and we don't want to die from that.